This evening, I wanted to talk about a couple of reasons why some people don't work in the local church, or what keeps people from working in the local church. And one of them is a deception, tricking people into not working in the local church. And the second one is an influence, an emotion maybe that prevents people from working or allows them to talk themselves out of working in the local church. So I don't have much of an introduction to this sermon. We'll start off with the first one, the trick, Satan's trick, and then we'll go into the second one right after that. So Satan's trick, and Satan's trick is a lack of commitment, a person not really understanding what it means or what's required of a servant of God, what Jesus required of a servant of God. So in order to be a disciple of Jesus, is Jesus required that we have to be determined to live for him. Now, that doesn't sound particularly complicated. We say, of course, we're all here. We all decided that we were going to be determined to live for Jesus. But it isn't as basic as sometimes we're led to believe. Our society teaches us that what it means to be a disciple of Jesus is perhaps just to attend a worship service once or twice a week, or to do a couple good things during the week and avoid doing some bad things during the week. And then if you do those things, then you have the right to call yourself a Christian or a Christ follower. Being a disciple has been presented as part of a person's larger identity. That faith is just something that you kind of add to the life that you're already living and then continue living the way, or similar to the way that you were before. So faith is an addition to somebody's life, that it's just one factor among many that guide a person's decision making about the future, and that somebody can love Jesus and live for Jesus while also loving and living for other things that live in their heart, other things that they may have affection for, that there's equal space for loving Jesus along with hobbies or jobs or friends or other interests or anything. That they can both take up equal space and that there's plenty of room for all of them. So I think this is kind of Satan's second tier of attack. When if Satan would really like to just keep you out of the church altogether, he doesn't want you hearing messages on Sunday or hearing the words of God at all. But if he can't keep you out, if he can't keep you from seeing the importance of Jesus, then he'll present what it means to follow Jesus in this way. He'll pervert what it means to follow Jesus. Satan says, okay, fine, you want to follow Jesus? Well, just make a little time on Sunday, 15 minutes of Bible study every week, but don't go crazy. Your life doesn't have to change. This doesn't need to be a massive commitment. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people that have been convinced that just adding or sprinkling a little bit of Jesus into their lives is what's required to become a disciple. And it is a deception of Satan. Unfortunately, though, that recipe, that formula for becoming a disciple was never approved or endorsed by Jesus himself. Satan presents it that way. He makes many people feel good because they do that. But when you actually look at the words of Jesus, you'll find that he required something very different of the people who were following him. Jesus' instructions on how to be a disciple were much different. They were difficult in a lot of ways. They were challenging to the people that heard them. We know that if we've read the Gospels, because many people would come to listen to Jesus, but then they wouldn't really stick around. They would leave after a while. A young man once came to Jesus, and he said this, Lord, and this is not a direct quote from any translation, but he says, Lord, I attend the synagogue. I keep the commandments. I haven't killed anybody. I haven't coveted anybody's stuff. I listen to the instructions of the rabbis. I try to love my neighbor as myself. And I keep all the Jewish feasts. And his question to Jesus was, will I inherit eternal life? Or will I go to heaven? Will I be with God forever? Now, if somebody came to you and said that, somebody said, I attend church or worship. I keep God's commandments to the best of my ability. I haven't killed anybody. I haven't coveted anybody else's stuff. I try to listen to what my elders say. I try to love my neighbor well. I participate in church activities. what would your response be? I think most of us would be tempted to say, oh, well, this person is definitely a disciple of Jesus. This person definitely meets all the requirements and if Jesus was here, he would approve of this person. Maybe we see that person as one of the best people in our congregations. But we have to be careful because we have to define discipleship and define those who will inherit the kingdom of heaven not by the world's standards, and certainly not by Satan's standards, but by Jesus' standards. And this is what Jesus said to this young man who was very rich. And this is the story of the rich young ruler, as it's often called, as you probably already know. Jesus says to him, "One thing you still lack. Sell all that you have and distribute to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come and follow me." And I think when we read that, a lot of people are caught off by that maybe because we ask why. Why does Jesus demand this of them? Because Jesus doesn't demand this of all of his disciples. Jesus doesn't tell us that we have to sell everything that we have and give it to the poor and not have any possessions left. Why is Jesus telling him that he needs to give everything to the poor? And the reason is because Jesus can see through this man's external obediences, which were a good thing. They weren't a bad thing, but he could see more than that. He can see what we often can't see. He could see into the heart of this man. He saw that there was something concerning there. The Bible tells us that this man was very, very rich. And on one side of him, Jesus saw that there was a genuine love for God. I think that is shown to us in the text, that this was a person who actually loved God in a lot of ways. But on the other side, there was something there that was keeping his heart from being given 100% to God, and that was his money. He loved his money as much, or at least in part, and that was taking up some room in his heart, and he wasn't ready to get rid of that. So love for God was part of what was impacting his decision making. Love for money was the other part. So Jesus asks them this, or he gives them this instruction, this command. He says, "Go and sell all that you have." Jesus didn't respond by saying, "Oh, it's okay that you love your money. There's plenty of room in your heart for both. It can be part of your larger identity. I'm not asking you to give me your whole self. I'm just asking you to make a little bit of room for me in your heart." That's not what Jesus said. Jesus responds, and he looked at the rich young man, and he said, "Give me your money." And when the man didn't do it, the man walked away, and the situation is a sad scene. And I think Jesus was even sad because the rich man wouldn't give him his heart. He says, "I've seen your heart, and I want all of your money right now. Go sell everything that you have and give it to the poor." Jesus did that because a disciple's heart can only have one supreme affection. And he wanted to know, or this young man wanted to know what God expected of his followers. And so Jesus told him, he said, God wants your entire heart. And he doesn't accept those who give him less. And I think it's implied in the text that those who give him less, those who aren't willing to give over their whole heart, they are not going to inherit the kingdom of heaven. They will not be with God forever. So it's not enough just to make a little bit of space for Jesus. He wants the entire thing. And so that's very different than the deception that Satan is putting in front of us, right? He says, just cut out a little bit of your week, cut out a little bit of your time, cut out a little bit of your heart for God, and the rest can still be yours. And Jesus is saying here, no, that's not the case at all. I have very high expectations of those who are going to follow me. So your heart must love God to a greater degree than anything else on earth. God must be the primary factor in your decision making. All of the other factors of your life, your job, your hobbies, your friends, your family, and all of your other interests must be viewed in light of God and in his governance of your life. And rather than viewing God as part of your identity, you must view him as the one who gives you your identity. When you become a disciple, you give your heart to God so that he can transform you, so that he can make you into something new, so that you can be made into a new creation. And you're not going to be the same person after that process as you were before. You shouldn't expect to be the same person as you were before. But who better to give you your identity than your Creator, who made you, who knows who you truly are, who knows the purpose for which you were made, who knows your your potential and who instilled that potential in you. But we have to give him the throne of our heart, and we have to dismiss all rival affections. So the young man in the story couldn't let his money go. He walked away from Jesus, and interestingly, Jesus lets him walk away. And Jesus doesn't say, "Oh, wait, no, stop. I didn't mean it. Come back. I'll lower the bar. I'll lower the restrictions. I'm trying to get as many people in here as I possibly can." He says, I'm not ready to, or by his actions, he says, "I'm not ready to give you all of myself." And Jesus says, "That's fine. I'm looking for people who are." And so he lets him walk away. And it is a sad situation, because when it comes to pursuing God's will for your life, it's all or nothing. So this is what Jesus required of his followers. And as I mentioned, it's a lot different than what Satan is trying to convince you that Jesus wants. And it's a lot different than a lot of modern churches will teach you that Jesus wants. And it's a lot different than some of your peers in the churches will expect from you. Right? Jesus has high expectations of those who want to follow him. So the question is, are we ready to make that kind of commitment? To love God more than anything, to allow God to define us, to let him shape us. If you expect God to show you a direction for your life and his will for your life, you have to give yourself to him 100%. And you can't be 100% committed if you're guided by something else. And so this is one major reason why people don't serve the Lord, is because they've been convinced that they don't need to, that they don't need to give all of that effort, that they can just give a little bit. And so in attendance and giving God a small portion of themselves, they believe that they're doing all that Jesus has required. They've been tricked into believing that a partially hearted disciple is an acceptable disciple, when Jesus says that isn't the case. Why do we see churches that are sometimes full of people, but those people don't seem to have any interest or any energy for serving the Lord? They just maybe come and sit in the pew for a few hours on Sunday. Well, it's because those people have misunderstood what Jesus what Jesus requires. It's interesting that sitting to receive the words of God has never been a mark of discipleship. It has never been the defining mark, maybe I should say, of discipleship. It's interesting because many churches have made it that way, right? If you come on Sunday morning, you come on Wednesday night, maybe you hear the lesson, maybe you partake of the Lord's Supper, that your attendance is a mark of your discipleship, of your Christianity. And it's interesting that in Jesus' ministry, that was never the case. Think of all the people who attended Jesus' sermons. There were tons of them, right? Thousands of them. And yet not all of those people were Jesus' disciples, and he says that much. Think about the Sermon on the Mount. Who knows how many people were there in the Sermon on the Mount listening to Jesus, but their attendance didn't mean that they were disciples. You think about the 5,000, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. They were all there receiving a message and receiving a miracle from Jesus, and yet their attendance wasn't what marked them as genuine believers, as people who had committed themselves entirely to Jesus. Attendance at those meetings was not the distinguishing factor between those who were right with God and those who weren't. God's kingdom is not built by people exclusively. Well, it's not. Certainly part of God's kingdom is attendance and a meeting with the saints, right? But that's not all of it. And God's kingdom is not built exclusively by coming to a building, by attending, by receiving or listening to a word from a preacher or from a teacher. There's much more than that. Obviously, it's those words then being acted out in our lives. God's kingdom is built when people take up their crosses and they follow Jesus. When the words that they hear in the pew motivate them to get out of the pew and to take actions. And genuine discipleship is one that hears Jesus' words and then does them, that bears the fruits of the Spirit. When faith overflows out of the pew, out of the building, into our homes, into our communities. If you do the math, this is not exact math, but if you calculate how much of the Christian life is spent in the pew, it's probably like 10%, right? 10% of the Christian life is lived in a pew. And that is why Satan is so determined to convince Christians that the pew represents discipleship. Because if only 10% of it happens in the pew, then there's 90% that's not going to get done if Satan can convince us that the pew is the only place that matters. There are lost souls to reach. There are leaders that need to be trained for the next generation. There are idols in our lives that we have to tear down. There's things in our lives that we need to sell because they've become competing interests or rivals in our hearts to Jesus. There are programs that need to be supported, families that need to be raised. There's support to those who have been caught up in sin that needs to be given. And if Satan can convince us that giving 10% is enough, then the church is going to diminish in our area. If only 10% of the work gets done, of course it is. There's so much more to do than the pew, and we can't buy into that deception of Satan that this is all that there is. There's so much more to do, and that's part of the reason that Jesus asks for 100%. So that's the first one that I wanted to look at. Things that keep people from working in the church is the first one, that they've been deceived. The second one is for people who want to give 100%, know that they should be giving 100%, and yet something is hindering them. Something is holding them back. There's an emotion or an influence that's holding them back. And that's the influence of fear and inadequacy. And I know that that's two things, but I want to cover it in one our final and second point. I thought we would focus on these things because I think that they affect a lot of people. I know that they affect me. I know that they affect many people that I know, and I think they're somewhat universal. Excuse me. And the degree to which we allow these feelings to affect us can drastically change our lives and what we accomplish in God's kingdom. So the fear and inadequacy. What is inadequacy? I think most of us know, but a definition is lacking the quality or the quantity that's required, insufficient for a purpose. Right? And then closely related to inadequacy is fear. Oftentimes we fear because we are inadequate, or we fear that we are. We fear when we feel inadequate for a task or whatever challenge we are being faced with. We fear when we feel inadequate to protect ourselves against a threat. And I want to talk about these feelings of inadequacy and fear from a Christian perspective. Maybe you, in the past, maybe right now, you have something in mind that you could think of that needs to be done in the church. Or maybe it's something that needs to be done to reach the lost. And nobody's doing it. You see this gap. You know that God would want that to be happening, but it's not happening. And you're thinking, well, nobody's doing that. But you look at yourself and you're thinking, I'm not sure that I'm equipped to do that job. I'm not sure that I'm up for that. You're worried that you may be inadequate. So what happens then? Do you just give up on that idea? Do you give up hope that that need is ever going to be met? Because you feel afraid and inadequate, does that mean that it isn't God's will for you to undertake that task? Yeah, I know in the past I've excused myself with that. I've thought, well, that needs to be done. I know God would want it to be done, but I don't really feel like those are my strengths. And so I'm going to just pull back from that, and maybe somebody will do it at some point and it'll get done. But I'm not the person. Is that how that should play out when we feel fear and inadequate to undertake that particular task? Let's talk about why your inabilities and inadequacies are not always a reason to give up on accomplishing a work that you know needs to be done, and why you shouldn't consider them all that important when you think about the way that God might use you in his kingdom. So there were 5,000 men standing in front of Jesus, and he turns to his apostles and he says, how are you guys planning to feed all of these people? And the text doesn't record their exact response, but you have to know that they were shocked by this question. So what did they do? We see and read about their actions. They immediately go and they start taking an inventory of everything that they have. They start taking account of their resources. John chapter 6, verses 8 and 9. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" So they assessed what they had on hand, and immediately they concluded that they didn't have enough food and they didn't have enough money to feed 50 people, much less 5,000 people. Jesus asked them to do something that was seemingly impossible, basically impossible for them. They went and they evaluated their resources and concluded that it couldn't be done. Now, of course, Jesus knew that they couldn't do it. He knew how much money they had in their pockets. He knew what they had in their bags and sacks as far as food and fish and bread. He knew that it couldn't be done. So the question is, why did he ask that in the first place? Is he just bothering them, making them feel, humbling them somehow? No, the text tells us in John chapter 6 that Jesus did that to test them. When God wanted them to do something big, the question was, to whom are they going to look? And the text tells us that when God asked them to do something big, they looked to themselves and they said, can't be done. Can't do it. We don't have what it takes. We don't have the money. We don't have the food. So, apply this back to ourselves now. Maybe there's been a time in your life when you've recognized a need, something that needs to be done. You evaluate the problem, you realize it's too big for you, and the resources that you personally have or can collect, and that it can't be accomplished. That discouragement can cause us just to quit on the idea entirely. But in doing that, we will reveal that we need to learn the same lesson that Jesus is teaching to his apostles in John chapter 6. We need the same test, and we may be failing the same test as the apostles in John chapter 6. The apostles needed to know where their sufficiency was going to come from for their work, their future work in the church. We need to understand the same thing. If the church is going to succeed in the future, how is it going to succeed? By our own power and our own resources, or is it going to succeed because God is helping us and because we need to be looking to him for sufficiency? Jesus instructs all the 5,000 men to sit down on the grass, and then he feeds them all. And the text tells us that the 5,000 had, quote, as much as they wanted. And at the end of the meal, Jesus told his apostles to go out and to gather the leftovers. And so Jesus starts with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and the apostles end up with 12 baskets full of leftovers. That's one for each, in case we're counting. Before this meal, when Jesus asked the disciples how they were going to feed the crowd, they immediately pointed out their inadequacy. That's where they looked. But at the end of the meal, they found themselves picking up 12 baskets full of bread, no doubt meant to remind them of Jesus' adequacy. It would have been a lesson to them that God could take something that seemed insufficient, something that was insufficient, and he made it sufficient. The product that God starts with is of no consequence to what he ultimately achieves. God uses inadequate people. And this is a lesson that we see all throughout the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. God uses men to do great things, men who initially thought themselves to be incapable. I think probably the famous one is Moses. We've all seen the 10 Commandments movie where Charlton Heston is making excuses for why he can't go to Egypt. And why he's not the guy, and why he can't speak well, and why he doesn't have the ability to lead the people out of Egyptian slavery. Gideon in the Judges, he was the least of the family of Manasseh, and he says, I'm not the one who is going to go do this job and deliver Israel from Midian. And he asks for all these signs, right, because he has so little confidence that he's the right guy. The apostles also probably believed themselves to be insufficient for leading the kingdom, a kingdom that their nation had been looking forward to for years. And they're thinking, we're like fishermen and tax collectors from Galilee. How are we going to lead this kingdom? So they believed themselves to be inadequate, but what else did these people have in common? What other trait was similar between them? I think, well, for one, what was similar is that they were all right about their assessment. They were all inadequate. It wasn't just a feeling. It was true. This wasn't some kind of show of humility on the parts of these men. They were not up for that job. Moses could not free Israel from Egypt. God had to do that through the 10 plagues, through the many, many miracles that came after that. Gideon couldn't free the people from the powerful Midianites. God had to do that miraculously. And the apostles were certainly inadequate to lead the early church. God had to send the Holy Spirit to empower them to be able to do that. They were all incapable. They were all underqualified. God was the one who gave them the ability to accomplish what they accomplished. And the question for us is Is that precedent still true for us today? Is God just done? Now God only lets the qualified in the church work. God only lets the people who have lots of skills and leadership skills and talents work in the church. He can't do anything else with everybody else is just, he can't do anything with them. You're just going to have to wait a while, right, for God to be able to use you for something. No, that's not the case at all. I don't think that there's any reason to believe that God stopped using incapable people to do great things after Moses and after Gideon and after the apostles. I think that's a precedent that's still true even today. And certainly God has the power to do it, and we would never doubt that. Maybe Jesus still places seemingly impossible tasks in front of us for the same reason that he did it to the apostles, to test us, as he did in John 6, to discover where Jesus is discovering where we believe that our sufficiency lies. Who are we going to look to? To ourselves, to our own resources, to our 5 loaves and our 2 fish? Or are we going to look to God, look to him? Maybe if we could learn the lesson that Jesus was teaching the apostles in John 6, we could be slower to calculate the odds of achieving something in the kingdom based off of our resources and quicker to evaluate them based on our God. Maybe it's more about being willing than it is about being adequate sometimes. Maybe God's looking for men and women who will start so that he can accomplish and he can finish great things through them. That's what he was looking for in Moses. That's what he was looking for in Gideon. That's what he's looking for in the apostles. And that's probably what he's looking for in us as well. When Jesus called you into his kingdom, he knew all of your weaknesses, all the things that you couldn't do, all the things that you weren't great at. And yet, he still says that there's a place for you and there's a role for you in his kingdom. And that's part of the scripture reading that was read before, that there's a place for everybody. This is a body and all the pieces work together. And you can't tell me that God can't use one of those pieces because it's just too useless, right? That's certainly not the case. He doesn't say, that Luke, I know that he's a Christian now, but there's just no place for him. He's just going to have to warm the pew for couple years until he's able to be used for anything valuable. And he's certainly not saying that about you. How do we think that Moses became Moses? The man Moses that we esteem as a spiritual leader. Do you think that he was just called that way? He was like that. He got that way as a shepherd in Midian. He got to work serving God only after he had developed all of his leadership skills and all of his talents. No, that's not the case. We know that. The story of Moses isn't about how great a leader Moses was and how God just had to prod him a little bit to get him to use his skills. He grew to be that man, or he grew to be the man that he was through the challenges that God walked him through, the challenges that in some cases he wasn't ready for, but God helped him through. Those challenges matured him into the Moses that we look up to the Moses that we admire. The potter shaped Moses into the man that we admire because Moses was open to being molded, and we need to be as well. How do you think that you'll grow into the potential that God has instilled in you? It won't be by sitting around just hoping that you acquire skills and that one day you'll be useful in the kingdom. And it'll be by opening yourself up to being shaped by the potter. And so as we finish up this evening, just think on these last couple things. It will be by that God will shape us into a servant of his, and it will be by maturing through the challenges that God will walk us through, the challenges that you probably think that you're not ready for, and you very well might be right about that, but even though you're not ready for some of those things, even though you don't have all the talents in place, God will walk you through them and help you to become the person that you need to be to complete them. God wants to see his church succeed. Of course, he'll help his saints to become what they need to be. A church full of people willing to let God develop them in spite of their weaknesses is a church that can turn their neighborhood and their community upside down. It's a church that has passed the test of Jesus in John 6 when he asked his disciples to feed the 5,000. It's a church that's aware of their inadequacies and looks to God for the power to accomplish the mission. So those are my 2 points for this evening, and maybe they have been beneficial to you. I hope that they have. One, the trick of Satan, that we don't need to give to God all that we are. And then the second one is the danger of letting fear and inadequacy hold us down and keep us from doing anything.